The crimson sun of Vehara bled across the horizon, casting jagged shadows through the towering crystalline trees. Captain Elias Marwick adjusted the high collar of his diplomat's uniform, its stiff fabric clinging uncomfortably in the humid air. His boots crunched across iridescent moss as he approached the ancient temple at the edge of the Nithari settlement, a place steeped in myth and unspoken power. He was here on a mission, finalizing a fragile treaty between humans and the Nithari. His experience as a seasoned mediator meant little in a place where logic bowed to strange customs. The Nithari were an enigmatic species known for their empathic abilities. Emotions bled through their shimmering skin in waves of color and subtle fragrance. For them, diplomacy was not just spoken but felt. As he reached the entrance, faint bioluminescent lines pulsed along the ancient stone, reacting to his presence. Siriel waited for him, standing tall in ceremonial robes that glimmered with the shifting hues of dawn. Her skin shimmered faintly with restless energy, a soft lavender glow trailing across her bare arms like living light. She was young by Nithari standards but carried an air of quiet authority despite her slender frame. "You're late," she said, her voice melodic but edged with tension. "Your sentries delayed me," Elias replied curtly. His gaze swept over the temple's imposing facade, veins of light weaving through its stone surface like veins in living flesh. "This place, it's active. It's the season of echoes," Siriel said, almost reluctantly. "The temple awakens during the cycle. We should finish quickly before." A low, resonant hum echoed from deep within the temple, cutting her off. The ground trembled underfoot, and Elias instinctively reached for his sidearm before remembering he wasn't here as a soldier. The temple's great stone doors groaned, sealing shut behind them with a finality that made his heart lurch. He moved toward the entrance, but there was no visible mechanism, just smooth, unyielding stone. "What's happening?" he demanded. Siriel pressed her fingertips against the wall, her glowing skin dimming in response. Her face paled. "The temple. It has recognized us." "Recognized us how?" Elias's voice was sharp. Her breath hitched. "As potential bondmates." For a long moment, silence filled the cavernous space, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of light that raced through the temple's walls like a heartbeat. "This is a mistake," Elias said stiffly. "We'll find another way out." But even as he spoke, he felt the temple's presence pressing down on them. Ancient, aware, and expectant. They ventured deeper, their footsteps echoing softly. The air grew warmer, tinged with something intoxicatingly sweet. The faint pulses of light intensified, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Elias kept his focus on the path ahead, but he couldn't ignore Siriel's presence at his side. Her scent, delicate and strange, wrapped around him like the lingering warmth of a fire. He told himself it was just the temple's influence, nothing more. He was a man of reason, hardened by years of duty, not some lovesick fool. Yet when her fingers brushed his arm, his breath caught. It was an accidental touch, brief but searing, as though her warmth had seeped into his very skin. She drew back quickly, her expression unreadable, but her bioluminescent markings shimmered with a faint, betraying glow. They reached a central chamber dominated by a towering stone archglyphs carved into its surface flared to life, casting soft golden light. Siriel hesitated, tracing the symbols with reverence. "This is a trial," she whispered. "A test of unity." Elias clenched his jaw. "Unity? What does that mean?" Before she could answer, the floor quaked, and walls of shimmering energy erupted around them, forming an enclosed ring. The charged air thrummed with expectant energy, crackling against his skin like static. Siriel staggered, visibly shaken. "The temple. It demands connection." His instincts screamed danger, but logic warred with something deeper, something primal that stirred beneath his skin, urging him closer to her warmth. "It's manipulating us," he growled, stepping toward her. But she shook her head. "It only amplifies what's already there." Their gazes locked, and in that charged silence, something broke. A wall neither of them had acknowledged until now. The distance between them vanished as if drawn together by unseen threads. Elias cupped her face, his calloused fingers trembling against her silken skin. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, time seemed suspended, held taut by the unspoken need that pulsed between them. Then, slowly, she leaned into his touch, her eyes glowing softly with trust, and something far more dangerous. Before either could move further, the temple's energy surged, shattering the fragile moment. The glyphs flared blindingly bright, forcing them apart as the chamber trembled with renewed intensity. Breathless and shaken, they stumbled back, pulse racing in unison. "The temple is watching," Siriel whispered, her voice tinged with something between fear and longing. Elias exhaled sharply, already calculating their next move. Whatever ancient force held them here wasn't done with them yet. The air in the chamber grew heavier, charged with an intensity that crackled along Elias's skin like static. His pulse pounded in rhythm with the flickering glow of the temple's walls. He forced himself to take a steadying breath, his mind wrestling against the strange, persistent thrum of need that the place seemed determined to stir in him. Siriel stood a few steps away, her luminous skin dimmer now but still shimmering faintly with soft pulses of light. Her breathing was shallow, and she avoided his gaze, as though she feared what he might see there, or what she might reveal. "We can't let this place control us," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Whatever it's doing, it's not real." Siriel's expression tightened. "It is real," she whispered. "That's the danger." Her words unsettled him. She pressed her hands against the temple wall, her glowing fingertips tracing the ancient glyphs that pulsed with matching intensity. He watched as light danced across her skin, responding to her touch with an almost intimate familiarity. "This place isn't just a building," she continued. "It's alive, feels us, attests us." He stepped closer, unwilling to admit how the sight of her affected him. The soft curve of her shoulders, the way her breath quickened as his presence closed the space between them. His fingers twitched with the urge to touch her again, to ground himself in something tangible, something real in this surreal place. Her head tilted slightly, sensing his nearness. Her bioluminescence flared, unbidden. "Elias?" Her voice trembled, unsure whether she was warning him or herself. Before he could respond, the temple trembled again, its low, resonant hum intensifying. Lines of light raced across the floor, weaving intricate patterns that glowed with urgent purpose. The chamber shifted, the walls shimmering like liquid, reshaping into something new. A passage opened on the far side, dark and foreboding, its entrance framed by glowing symbols that pulsed like a beckoning heartbeat. Siriel stiffened. "It wants us to move forward," she said, "or it's luring us deeper." His gaze stayed on the passage, alert for any sign of danger. He reached for his sidearm instinctively, only to curse under his breath. He had left his weapon behind when entering the diplomatic zone. He felt exposed, defenseless, human. They advanced cautiously. The air grew warmer as they moved through the narrow corridor, close enough that his arm brushed hers with every step. Her skin was impossibly warm, almost feverish. Each accidental touch burned like a brand. He clenched his jaw. Focus. He couldn't afford to let his mind slip into that. Not here. Not now. But the temptation gnawed at his restraint with relentless precision. Ahead, the corridor opened into a circular chamber lit by a soft, flickering radiance. An elaborate stone altar rose at the center, surrounded by carved figures entwined in poses of unmistakable intimacy. The air pulsed with an undeniable sensual charge, thick and intoxicating. Elias inhaled sharply, fighting against the haze clouding his thoughts. He was a man of reason and discipline, trained to withstand physical and psychological pressures. But this was different, more insidious. The temple didn't just manipulate the senses, it amplified something far deeper. He forced himself to look away from the carvings and found Siriel watching him, her luminous eyes wide, searching his face with equal parts fear and yearning. Her breathing was unsteady, her bioluminescent glow flaring in a rhythm that mirrored his racing pulse. "We have to complete the trial," she said softly. "It won't let us go until we prove ourselves." "What does that mean?" he demanded, though a part shame and vulnerability flashing across her features. "The temple responds to connection. Emotional. Physical." Her voice broke on the last word, as though even saying it threatened to unravel her control. "It tests bonds by forcing what it senses." His breath caught. It made terrible, undeniable sense. This place fed on emotions, desires, urges, things neither of them could fully suppress in such close proximity. It demanded intimacy. Elias closed the distance between them before he realized he'd moved. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining without conscious thought. Her skin was impossibly soft, trembling against his touch. He felt her breath hitch, saw the faint glow intensify across her cheeks like an unspoken confession. "We won't let it break us," he murmured, his voice rough but resolute. "We face this together." Siriel exhaled a shaky breath and nodded, her fingers tightening around his like she was holding onto the last solid thing in a world that had turned fluid and uncertain. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she rested her free hand on his chest, her palm settling just over his heart. Her touch burned through the fabric of his uniform, setting his pulse aflame. He didn't pull away, couldn't. Her luminous eyes met his, glowing with emotions too complex to name. "If we give in, there's no going back," she whispered, her voice trembling with both warning and need. "I know." His fingers gently brushed her cheek, tracing the soft, glowing curve. "But if this is what the temple demands, we choose how we face it." Their breaths mingled, the charged air between them almost crackling with intensity. Neither moved, caught in a fragile, desperate stillness where surrender and defiance were inseparable. Then the ground quaked beneath their feet, light blazing across the chamber's walls like a breath held too long finally released. The temple's pulse surged, impatient, demanding, forcing them into the next trial before they were ready. The walls of the chamber pulsed with a relentless rhythm, sending faint vibrations to the floor beneath Elias's boots. The charged air prickled his skin, making every breath feel heavy, saturated with expectation. His grip on Siriel's hand remained firm, steadying them both as the temple's light continued its hypnotic dance. For a moment, they stood motionless, the world narrowing to the shared warmth between their intertwined fingers. Then the air shifted, and the chamber's walls shimmered, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. The temple was changing again, remolding itself in response to something unseen but unmistakably felt. Siriel exhaled sharply, breaking the spell. "It knows we haven't completed the bond." Her voice was tight, laced with both frustration and something far more vulnerable. Elias's jaw clenched. He hated the power this place wielded over them, how it twisted even the simplest touch into something fraught with meaning. But there was no escaping the reality. They were trapped, and the temple's demands were clear. It would not release them until they surrendered, not just physically but emotionally. The ground beneath them shuddered again, and without warning, the floor split apart, forming a deep, glowing chasm. A narrow stone bridge extended across the void, precarious and impossibly thin. Symbols carved into the rock radiated with pulsating light, synchronized with the temple's heartbeat. "It's testing our trust," Siriel whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to cross together." Elias eyed the bridge warily. The drop below disappeared into a swirling abyss of light, endless and disorienting. Falling didn't seem like the worst possibility. He doubted the temple would be that merciful. "We move together," he said firmly, his hand tightening around hers. "Don't let go." She nodded, drawing a deep, steadying breath. Her fingertips pulsed faintly against his palm, matching the rhythm of his racing heartbeat. They stepped onto the bridge, its surface smooth and cold underfoot. The air seemed to shift again, turning warmer, denser, clinging to their skin like silk. Each step felt weighted, charged with unseen pressure. Halfway across, the temple struck. A sudden surge of energy flared through the walls, sending a pulse of light racing toward them. The bridge quaked violently, forcing Elias to stagger, nearly losing his footing. Siriel cried out as the light seared toward them, crackling with raw, primal force. Without thinking, Elias pulled her into his arms, shielding her from the surge with his own body. The impact hit like a physical blow, driving them to their knees. Pain bloomed along his back, burning through his nerves. But he held on, held her. For a breathless moment, there was only stillness. Then he realized her arms were around him, clutching him with desperate strength. Her breath was warm against his neck, trembling with relief, or perhaps something deeper. "You didn't let go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never will." The words slipped free before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way that startled even him. She drew back just enough to meet his gaze. Her luminous eyes shimmered, filled with something unspoken, something that made his chest ache. The temple pulsed again, but this time the light was softer, warmer, almost approving. Before he could fully process the shift, she cupped his face, her fingers trembling against his stubbled jaw. "Elias, I can't keep fighting this." His breath hitched. Neither could he. Not anymore. Slowly, carefully, he brushed a strand of her shimmering hair from her face, his fingertips grazing the delicate curve of her cheek. Her eyes fluttered closed for a brief moment, leaning into his touch like she couldn't help herself. When she opened her eyes again, there was no hesitation, only resolve. He tilted her chin gently, closing the remaining distance between them. Their lips met in a slow, searching kiss that deepened with every passing second, igniting something fierce and undeniable between them. Her hands slid up his chest, clutching at the fabric of his uniform as though anchoring herself to him. His arms circled her, drawing her closer until there was no space left between them. Only shared warmth, shared breath. The temple's glow intensified, its pulse matching the wild rhythm of their hearts. The bridge steadied beneath them, its surface solid once more, as though acknowledging their surrender. Not to the temple, but to each other. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, Elias rested his forehead against hers, savoring the closeness he'd fought so hard to deny. "We're still here," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "For now," she whispered, her fingers tracing faint patterns across his chest. "But the trial isn't over." He nodded, unwilling to release her just yet. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The temple had tested their trust, and now it seemed it would test the strength of their bond. The chamber beyond the bridge was unlike anything Elias or Siriel had encountered so far. The walls shimmered with fluid-like currents of light, glowing faintly in shifting hues of silver and gold. Delicate, vine-like patterns crawled across the stone, weaving intricate symbols that pulsed softly in time with the ever-present heartbeat of the temple. Elias kept his hand firmly clasped around Siriel's, drawing strength from her warmth. His instincts warned him that they were far from safe, despite the calm that seemed to settle over the space. The temple was watching, always watching, its presence lingering in the air like static just before a storm. Siriel's eyes traced the living glyphs etched into the walls, her expression distant yet intense. She had fallen quiet since the bridge, her luminous skin dimmed as if wrapped in thought, or something heavier. "What is this place?" Elias asked, his voice low, wary. She didn't answer immediately, her fingers brushing one of the glowing symbols with reverence. The faint lines of light brightened at her touch, responding like a living thing craving connection. She withdrew her hand as though burned. "It's a memory chamber," she whispered, her voice tight. "A place where the past is felt." Before Elias could press her further, the air stirred, and the chamber came alive. The walls rippled, reshaping into towering stone arches entwined with glowing roots. The space stretched, shifting into something vast and open, yet still enclosed by unseen boundaries. Then came the voices, faint at first, soft echoes carried on the charged air, but growing clearer with each passing breath. Whispers of emotions, sharp and raw, brushed against Elias's mind like distant memories not his own. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus, but the sensation intensified with alarming speed. Sirael staggered beside him, pressing a hand to her temple as if trying to block out the invasive echoes. Her bioluminescent markings flared erratically, reflecting her inner turmoil. "We have to keep moving," Elias urged, wrapping an arm around her waist to steady her. Her body trembled against his, and for a fleeting moment, she leaned into him, seeking comfort she couldn't ask for aloud. But the chamber wouldn't let them go. Glowing symbols surged with brilliant intensity, and the ground beneath them rippled like liquid stone. Elias barely had time to shield Sirael before the light consumed them both, pulling them into its grasp. Elias blinked against the sudden brightness, his breath hitching as he realized they were no longer in the temple's central chamber. They stood in a place carved from memory, her memory. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and something sharper, more bitter, like regret. They stood on a high, windswept plateau overlooking an endless expanse of alien forests glowing faintly under twin moons. The view was hauntingly beautiful but tinged with sorrow. Sirael gasped softly beside him, recognition dawning in her wide, luminous eyes. "This is my home." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Before Elias could speak, a new figure emerged from the glowing mist, tall, imposing, draped in ceremonial robes adorned with the shimmering symbols of the Nithari elders. His face was severe, his expression carved from stone. Elias felt Sirael tense beside him, her fingers curling into fists. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling with long-buried pain. The elder's gaze passed over her without acknowledgement, cold and distant. His bioluminescence remained dim, a pointed rejection by Nithari standards. "You have failed our people." The elder's voice echoed, harsh and unyielding. "You are unworthy." Sirael flinched as though struck, her glow flickering like a dying flame. Elias stepped in front of her without thinking, shielding her from the figure's judgmental stare. "She's more worthy than you'll ever know," he growled, his voice low and fierce. "Whatever this is, it's not real." But the elder's image didn't waver. "You cannot deny what she feels. The bond you seek will break under the weight of her past." The ground trembled, cracks of light splintering beneath their feet. Sirael's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked impossibly small, trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. Elias caught her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Sidai, look at me." Her eyes shimmered with unshed emotion, torn between defiance and despair. "This place isn't stronger than you," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. "It feeds on doubt, on fear. Don't give it that power." Her lips parted as though to argue, but instead, she surged forward, pressing her forehead against his chest, clutching his uniform with desperate strength. He wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, holding her as tightly as he dared. "You are not alone," he whispered fiercely. "I'm still here." The temple's pulse stuttered, the light faltering as though confused by their defiance. The elder's image flickered, losing its cool clarity. Slowly, Sirael lifted her head, meeting Elias's gaze with renewed strength. The glow of her bioluminescent markings steadied, burning brighter than before. Clear, fierce, alive. "I choose to move forward," she whispered, voice steady despite the quiver of emotion beneath it. "With you." Elias smiled, a rare, genuine warmth breaking through his hardened exterior. "Then let's finish this." The memory shattered, dissolving into cascading light as the chamber released them. Its trial passed, but not without cost. As reality solidified around them once more, they stood together, still holding on. Their bond had endured, strengthened by what they'd faced, and what they'd chosen to fight for. The chamber's oppressive silence faded into a soft, rhythmic hum as the temple shifted once more, reshaping its walls with fluid grace. The carved symbols that had pulsed with harsh, judgmental light now glowed gently, their patterns weaving into calmer, flowing designs. The air was warmer, tinged with the faint scent of something sweet and familiar, like wild blooms after a rain. Elias kept his arm around Siriel, unwilling to let her go even after the memory's haunting grip had dissolved. Her breathing steadied against his chest, but she remained still, as though bracing for the next trial. He could still feel the faint tremor in her frame, the last echoes of the pain the temple had forced her to relive. "You're stronger than it knows," he murmured, his voice rough but sure. Siriel slowly lifted her head, her luminous eyes searching his face. A faint blush of soft lavender shimmered across her cheeks, a flicker of something warmer than fear, though just as vulnerable. "I didn't think it would go that far," she whispered. "The temple isn't supposed to create that. It feeds on what it senses," Elias said grimly. "Doubt, pain." His hand slid from her back to her shoulder, lingering just long enough to offer comfort. "But you fought it." Her lips curved faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We fought it." The moment stretched between them, charged but fragile, tethered by more than shared survival. He knew he should step back, create space before the temple twisted this connection into something more dangerous, but he couldn't. Not now. Before he could speak, a soft breeze stirred the chamber, and the walls rippled like water disturbed by an unseen current. A path opened ahead, faintly glowing with an inviting warmth. No violent bruises, no threatening giggles, just stillness. "Sirei fronet." "It's different." Elias nodded cautiously. "Maybe it's done testing," but neither of them believed that. The temple never gave without cost. They walked side by side down the winding path, their steps slow but steady. The further they went, the more the space around them shifted, softening into something almost serene. The walls gleamed with soft, golden light, vines of glowing flowers stretching across the stone like living veins. The air was warmer here, filled with a heady, calming fragrance that seemed to ease even the tension in Elias's shoulders. They emerged into an open, circular chamber lit by cascading light from above. Delicate streams of water trickled from unseen sources, flowing into shallow pools that mirrored the soft, luminous glow of the temple's markings. "Sirei inalakshadapli." As sanctuary, Elias scanned the space warily. It looked peaceful, but after everything they'd endured, he couldn't trust appearances. "Is it another test?" Siriel hesitated, brushing her fingertips along the edge of one of the glowing pools. The water shimmered gently, its light responding to her touch. "No. This place, it's meant for rest, for renewal." Reluctantly, Elias allowed himself to relax just a fraction. The space did seem different. No threatening energy, no oppressive pulses. Just calm, quiet. Siriel dipped her hands into the water, letting the cool liquid trail across her skin. Her glow softened, her breathing slowing as though the water soothed something deeper than exhaustion. "You should try it," she suggested, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice was lighter now, a faint teasing edge creeping into her tone. "It won't bite." Elias huffed a quiet laugh and knelt by the edge of the pool, letting the cool water wash over his hands. It was surprisingly refreshing, chasing away some of the lingering tension from his muscles. Siriel moved beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she settled at the water's edge. Her bioluminescent glow rippled softly, a faint, pulsing rhythm that seemed calmer now, less restrained. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the gentle trickling of water and the faint hum of the temple's presence, no longer oppressive but distant, almost protective. "It's strange," Siriel said softly. "I never thought someone like you would stand by me the way you have." Elias turned, his brow furrowing. "Someone like me?" Her gaze remained on the water. "A human, a soldier." Her voice grew quieter. "Someone who could have walked away." "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I don't care what this place throws at us." She met his gaze then, her eyes shimmering with something far more vulnerable than before. "You mean that, don't you?" Every word. The stillness stretched between them, no longer tense but charged with something deeper, something neither of them could deny. Elias reached out slowly, brushing a stray strand of shimmering hair from her face. His fingertips lingered, tracing the delicate curve of her cheek. Siriel leaned into his touch, her breath hitching softly. Her glowing markings flared faintly, a soft, instinctive response she couldn't suppress. Before he could think better of it, he cupped her face gently, letting his thumb brush the edge of her jaw. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a heartbeat, she simply breathed, letting herself feel. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand, resting it lightly against his chest, right over his heart. His pulse quickened beneath her touch, steady and strong, matching the thrumming rhythm of the temple's distant hum. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling, suspended in fragile, perfect stillness. For the first time, the temple's presence felt quiet, waiting. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "With everything." Elias exhaled sharply, his thumb brushing her cheek one last time. "You have me," he promised. Soft, low and fierce. The pulsing glow of the sanctuary seemed to brighten, wrapping around them like a protective embrace, acknowledging what neither of them could deny any longer. Together they had passed through fire and emerged whole. But even in the stillness, the temple's watchful presence remained, silently preparing its next trial. The sanctuary's gentle warmth lingered long after Elias and Siriel left its tranquil embrace, their fingers still loosely entwined as they followed the softly glowing path ahead. The air felt lighter here, the oppressive presence of the temple momentarily subdued, but not gone. The distant, steady hum of its ancient heartbeat reminded them that its trials were far from over. The corridor twisted and narrowed, forcing them closer. Each step echoed softly, their boots brushing against smooth, shimmering stone. Elias's gaze remained sharp, ever watchful, though his hand stayed protectively at Siriel's side. He couldn't shake the feeling that the temple was waiting, gathering its strength for something far worse than what they'd faced before. Siriel walked in thoughtful silence, her luminous skin glowing faintly in rhythm with her steady breaths. But there was something fragile about the way she held herself now, a vulnerability just beneath the surface, carefully shielded but not entirely hidden. Before Elias could ask what was on her mind, the corridor widened abruptly into a vast, open expanse bathed in shifting golden light. The chamber stretched far beyond sight, its towering walls carved with intertwining symbols that pulsed with slow, measured intent. At its center rose a massive, circular platform etched with deep, ancient glyphs, silent but expectant. Siriel tensed beside him, her fingers tightening around his. This is a binding circle." Elias frowned. "What does that mean?" "It's used for sealing fates." Her voice faltered. "For bonds? Or breaking them?" Before he could respond, the air around them shifted violently. The chamber's tranquil glow twisted into sharp, burning crimson, and the ground quaked beneath their feet. Elias braced himself, drawing Siriel behind him just as a jagged arc of energy split the air, surging toward the circle. The ancient glyphs erupted into brilliant light, weaving a barrier of shimmering power around the platform's edge. The temple had activated the binding circle, and its intent was unmistakable. Siriel's breathing quickened. "It's going to test the bond." Elias grimaced. "We've already proven ourselves." "Not completely." Her voice trembled with realization. "It doesn't just test trust. It tests faith. In each other, and in the bond itself." Before he could fully grasp her meaning, a deep, resonant pulse echoed through the chamber, vibrating through his chest like thunder. The light intensified, splitting into two opposing arcs that surged toward them. Unstoppable, inevitable. Elias didn't hesitate. He pushed Siriel clear just as the energy struck, searing through his body with ruthless precision. Pain lanced through his every nerve, sharp and relentless, forcing him to his knees. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. But the temple wasn't done. The energy dragged him toward the binding circle's center, locking him in place with glowing chains of pure light. He struggled against them, but they held fast, unyielding. Elias! Siriel's cry cut through the haze of pain. Raw and desperate, she raced toward him. But another surge of light erupted from the ground, forming an impenetrable barrier between them. Siriel slammed against the glowing wall, her hands blazing with bioluminescent power as she tried to break through. But the temple's will was absolute. "Stay back," Elias shouted hoarsely, straining against his restraints. "It's after me." But Siriel didn't retreat. Her glow intensified with fierce determination. Her expression twisted with fear and defiance. "I'm not leaving you." Before either of them could react, the chamber's light shifted once more, this time forming a towering, spectral figure forged from memory and power. Its face was obscured, its form flickering with harsh, angular light. But its presence was unmistakably judgmental. Elias felt its gaze pierce through him, weighing everything he was, everything he had done. His past rose unbidden. Every failure, every choice, every soul lost under his command. The temple wasn't just testing his faith, it was forcing him to relive the worst of himself. "You are unworthy," the spectral figure intoned, its voice hollow and final. "Your past defines you. You cannot be trusted." Elias clenched his fists, fighting the crushing weight of its judgment. He'd carried these burdens his whole life, endured them in silence. But now, with Siriel watching, they burned deeper than ever before. "You're wrong." Siriel's voice rang out, fierce and unyielding. She pressed her hands against the barrier, her bioluminescence blazing with raw defiance. "He is more than his past. More than this." The spectral figure shifted, its hollow gaze turning toward her. "Prove it." Without hesitation, Siriel thrust her hands into the barrier, her glow surging with unimaginable intensity. The temple's energy crackled, resisting. But she pushed harder, her light weaving through the binding circle's ancient glyphs like living fire. Elias gasped as the chains binding him shuddered, loosening ever so slightly. He could feel her presence, fierce, unwavering, real. "You are not defined by your past," she cried, her voice trembling but resolute. "I see you, for who you are, for who you could be." Her words tore through the spectral figure's hollow facade like a blade of light. The glowing chains shattered, releasing Elias with a blinding surge of power. He staggered forward, breathless and disoriented, but free. Before he could collapse, Siriel was there, catching him in her arms. Her glow dimmed as she cradled his face, her touch trembling but steady. "I've got you." His fingers curled weakly around hers, grounding himself in her warmth, her presence. "You pulled me back. I always will," she whispered, fierce and certain. The binding circle dissolved, its purpose fulfilled. The chamber's harsh light softened once more, fading into a calm, steady pulse. The temple approved. But even as they held onto each other, breathing hard and still trembling from the ordeal, they knew one truth. The final trial was still ahead. The temple would demand more than trust, more than faith. It would demand everything. The air in the temple was eerily still after the binding circle dissolved, leaving Elias and Siriel in the dimly lit chamber. The faint glow from the etched glyphs on the walls pulsed gently, but the temple's ever-present hum now felt expectant, watching, waiting. Elias leaned heavily against one of the smooth stone pillars, still catching his breath after the brutal trial. Siriel knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked the burns left by the temple's restraints on his wrists. Her soft glow flickered erratically, betraying the emotions she fought to suppress. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "I'm fine," he rasped, though his voice was hoarse with exhaustion. He caught her hand before she could pull away, holding her gaze. "You saved me." Again, her lips corked into a faint, shaky smile. "I'm getting used to it." Despite the lingering ache in his chest, Elias couldn't help but return the smile. There was something grounding about her presence, something that steadied him in a way nothing else ever had. He squeezed her hand gently, letting his thumb trace slow, reassuring circles against her palm. Before either of them could say more, The air thickened, charged with sudden intensity. The glyphs flared brightly, casting twisting shadows across the walls. The temple was far from finished with them. Siriel rose swiftly, helping Elias to his feet just as the ground beneath them began to tremble. With a deep, groaning sound, the far side of the chamber cracked open, revealing a winding staircase carved from gleaming stone. Faint trails of light spiraled upward, beckoning them higher. "The final trial," Siriel said quietly, her expression unreadable. Elias steadied himself, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, we face it together." She nodded, though her fingers tightened around his almost instinctively. Without another word, they ascended the staircase, step by step, guided only by the soft glow of the temple's strange, living light. The stairs eventually opened into a vast, circular chamber at the temple's heart. Unlike the other rooms, the space was stark and empty, its floor smooth and polished like glass, reflecting the swirling light of the towering, domed ceiling above. The air pulsed with an unmistakable presence. Siriel exhaled sharply, and her eyes wide with recognition. "This is the Judgment Hall." Elias scanned the room warily, every muscle in his body coiled tight. "What does it want?" Before she could answer, the light coalesced into a massive, radiant figure. Neither fully human nor alien, but something far older. Its face was a blank mask of shimmering light, its towering form encased in ever-shifting symbols that radiated authority and judgment. "The final trial has begun," the temple's voice intoned, deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber like thunder. "Your bond is incomplete." Elias stepped protectively in front of Siriel, his expression grim. "We've faced every challenge you've thrown at us. What more do you want?" The temple's gaze turned toward them both, its presence pressing down like a crushing weight. Truth, full surrender, complete understanding. No bond can endure without them. Before they could react, the floor beneath their feet shattered like fractured glass, splitting them apart. Siriel cried out as she was pulled to one side of the chamber, a shimmering barrier of light trapping her behind an impenetrable wall. Elias lunged toward her, but the ground shifted again, forcing him back. "Elias!" she shouted, slamming her fists against the barrier. He surged forward, but the temple's voice boomed again. "Face what lies hidden." The world around them twisted violently, dragging them into a shared vision forged from memory, fear, and truth. Elias found himself standing in the shattered ruins of a battlefield. Flames licked the distant horizon, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. The screams of the fallen echoed faintly, distorted by memory. But he knew this place. His breathing quickened as he took a halting step forward, his eyes locking onto the twisted remains of his old military outpost. It was his battlefield, the one he'd spent years trying to forget, and failing. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out. Sharp, panicked. "Captain, we're surrounded. There's no way out." He froze, recognizing the terrified face of one of his former soldiers, a young man he hadn't been able to save. His chest clenched painfully as the memory played out before him in brutal, merciless clarity. "No," he rasped, his fists clenching helplessly. "Not again." The temple's cold, unyielding voice echoed through the broken landscape. "You failed. You couldn't save them. You cannot protect her." "Stop." Siriel's voice shattered the memory's hold, breaking through the haze of grief and guilt. Her image burned brightly at the edge of the battlefield, her bioluminescent skin glowing with fierce determination. "You are more than your failures," she cried, reaching for him across the fractured expanse. "I see you, and I choose you, every part of you." Elias stumbled toward her, his breath ragged. Her words pierced through the crushing weight of guilt, steadying him with their unwavering truth. The battlefield dissolved in a blinding flash of light. When the world solidified once more, they stood together in the temple's central chamber. The barrier between them finally shattered. Their hands met instinctively, fingers intertwining as if anchoring them to reality. The temple's towering presence loomed above them, its light dimming ever so slightly. You have faced what lies hidden, the temple intoned, its voice softer now. You have seen and chosen. Elias cupped Siriel's face, his fingers trembling slightly but steady. You pulled me back. Again. You've never left me, she whispered, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Their foreheads touched, breath mingling, holding onto the fragile, beautiful stillness between them. The chamber pulsed one final time, and the radiant figure slowly dissolved into cascading light, leaving only calm and acceptance. They had passed the final trial not by defeating the temple, but by trusting in each other, fully and completely. Together, they stood in the heart of the ancient temple, no longer trapped but free. The air in the temple felt different now, lighter, warmer, almost serene. The ever-present hum of its ancient pulse had faded into a steady, peaceful rhythm, as though satisfied at last. Soft streams of light rippled gently across the walls, weaving patterns of quiet approval. Elias and Siriel stood in the heart of the temple, still locked in each other's embrace. Their hands remained entwined, fingers curled together as if neither could bear to let go. The memory of the temple's last, grueling trial still clung to the edges of their minds, but the crushing weight of its judgment was gone. Siriel rested her forehead against his chest, her breath trembling as the tension she'd carried for so long slowly unraveled. His arms encircled her, steady and grounding, offering a comfort she hadn't dared to hope for. It's over, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We made it. Elias exhaled a deep, steadying breath. Together, her fingers traced slow, absent patterns against his chest, her bioluminescence glowing faintly where their skin met. She could still feel the lingering echoes of the bond they had forged, not imposed by the temple, but chosen, fiercely and without reservation. After a long, quiet moment, she finally lifted her head, meeting his gaze. His face was still drawn with exhaustion, the shadows of the past etched deeply into his features. But his eyes were steady, fierce, and real. What happens now? Elias asked, his voice low but certain. Siriel smiled faintly, though her expression remained thoughtful. The temple's purpose is fulfilled. We're free. The word felt strange on her tongue, almost foreign after everything they had endured. Freedom had seemed like an impossible dream, something distant and untouchable. But now, standing beside him, it felt real. Before she could say more, the ground beneath them shifted, not with threat, but with quiet intent. A soft, resonant pulse rippled outward, drawing their attention toward the far wall, where the smooth stone parted like petals unfurling in the dawn. A path revealed itself, a winding, glowing walkway leading upward toward the open sky. The first light of dawn poured through the entrance, bathing the ancient stone in soft gold. Elias gently brushed a strand of her shimmering hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering just long enough to send a warm shiver down her spine. Ready, she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Always. They walked side by side up the winding path, leaving the temple's depths behind. The air grew fresher with every step, carrying the faint, sweet scent of Vehara's alien blossoms. The living walls of the temple gradually faded into smooth stone, then into open sky as they emerged onto a high, windswept plateau overlooking the vast, glowing forests below. The view was breathtaking. Twin suns rose slowly over the horizon, casting shimmering light across the endless expanse of crystalline trees and flowing rivers of liquid light. The world stretched out before them, vast, untamed, and full of possibility. Siriel turned to Elias, her glowing eyes shimmering with quiet wonder. We're out. He nodded, letting his gaze sweep across the distant horizon before resting on her. We are. The wind stirred softly around them, brushing against their skin like a gentle reminder of the world waiting beyond. But neither of them moved, rooted in that fragile, perfect stillness. After a moment, Siriel took a slow, hesitant step forward, turning to face him fully. Her hands rested lightly against his chest, her fingers tracing the worn edges of his uniform with quiet reverence. I never thought anyone would fight for me like that, she admitted, her voice trembling just slightly. Not after everything. Elias caught her hands, holding them firmly between his own. You're worth fighting for. You always were. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, all the walls she had carefully built around herself crumbled. She surged forward, wrapping her arms around him and holding him fiercely, as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. He held her just as tightly, resting his chin against her hair. They stayed like that, tangled in each other's arms, grounded in the shared certainty that neither of them would ever face the world alone again. When she finally pulled back, her eyes shimmered with unshed emotion, but also with hope. What now? She asked softly, almost shyly. Elias smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his otherwise serious features. Whatever we want. The wind stirred again, warm and inviting, carrying the distant song of Vehara's strange and beautiful wilderness. A new journey stretched out before them, unwritten and full of possibility. Together, they stepped into the dawn, leaving the past behind and embracing whatever future the universe had in store. For both of them, the twin suns of Vehara hung high in the endless sky, casting shimmering light over the crystalline forests stretching toward the horizon. The alien world felt more alive than ever, pulsing with an energy that seemed to echo the ancient temple's quiet, watchful presence far below. The temple was silent now, its trials complete. Cliff overlooking the glowing expanse stood Elias and Siriel, side by side, their fingers intertwined in a quiet, familiar gesture. They had long since left the temple behind, but its lessons, its bond, remained carved into their very souls. The wind tugged gently at Siriel's flowing robes, her bioluminescent markings glimmering faintly in the sunlight. She tilted her head back, savoring the fresh air, free of the heavy, expectant presence they had endured for so long. Freedom tasted like possibility. Still getting used to it? Elias asked, his voice warm and steady. She glanced at him with a soft smile. A world without walls. It feels strange. Her gaze drifted back to the horizon. But good. He nodded, his expression thoughtful as he followed her gaze. The world beyond was vast and unpredictable, but for the first time, the unknown didn't seem like a threat. Felt like hope. A sudden chime from his communicator interrupted the stillness, its sharp tone pulling them both back to reality. Elias sighed and retrieved the small, worn device from his belt. The screen blinked with an incoming message from the diplomatic outpost they had been assigned to before everything had changed. They finally noticed we're still alive, he muttered, thumbing the communicator on. The stern face of Commander Arlen Finn filled the small screen, his brow furrowed with barely concealed impatience. Captain Marwick, you're late for the summit report. His gaze flicked to Siriel, his expression cooling. Both of you. We were delayed, Elias replied smoothly, his tone dry but respectful. Finn's eyes narrowed. Your assignment wasn't a vacation, Captain. We've received reports that the Nithari Council is preparing to suspend negotiations after your prolonged absence. Before Elias could respond, Siriel stepped forward, her bioluminescence flaring with quiet authority. We're ready for the talks, Commander. The Council will listen. Finn's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he gave a curt nod. You'd better hope they do. The future of the entire alliance depends on it. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only the soft static of the communicator. Elias lowered the device, letting out a slow breath. Right back into the fire. Siriel smiled faintly, though her expression grew more serious. The Council will listen, but only if we face them together. Her unwavering certainty steadied him, just as it always did. He gently brushed his fingers against hers, savoring the familiar warmth of her touch. Let's remind them what we've survived, he said, his voice low but resolute. They descended the winding path from the cliffside, their steps steady and sure. The Nithari settlement lay in the valley below, a sprawling collection of bioluminescent spires entwined with living vines that pulsed faintly with energy. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of distant activity, though the atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. As they approached the central council hall, murmurs spread through the gathered crowd of Nithari and human delegates. Some stared in open disbelief, others with wary curiosity. After all, few had expected either of them to return alive. The towering doors of the council hall opened slowly, revealing the vast, luminous chamber within. Carved stone pillars entwined with living light formed a circle around the central dais, where the Nithari elders stood waiting in solemn silence. The eldest speaker, a regal figure draped in flowing ceremonial robes, stepped forward. Her sharp, calculating gaze lingered on Siriel, her expression unreadable. "You return. Together?" she intoned, her voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. "The temple released you?" "Yes," Siriel answered firmly. "We passed its trials." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the gathered elders. The temple's judgment was legendary among their people, an ancient force that few had ever faced, let alone survived. "And yet, you stand with him," the eldest speaker continued, her tone sharp, dismissive. "A human, an outsider." Siriel lifted her chin, her glowing markings flaring brighter with renewed strength. "He is no outsider. He is my equal, my bond." Her declaration rang through the hall like a challenge, silencing the whispered doubts. Elias stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We didn't just survive the temple, we chose each other. We faced its judgment and passed." The air in the chamber grew heavy, charged with quiet intensity. For a long, breathless moment, the elders remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Then, slowly, the eldest speaker inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, if not full acceptance. "The bond is recognized." The council hall erupted into a chorus of murmurs, some approving, others wary. But the decision had been made. Their bond, their future, was no longer something that could be denied. As the tension in the chamber slowly eased, Siriel turned to Elias, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. His hand found hers once more, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "We did it," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Elias smiled, his thumb brushing gently against her palm. Together, the twin suns continued their slow ascent, casting warm light over the distant horizon. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time it was theirs to shape, and they would face it side by side.